This is our lecture number 29. We're going to be discussing sexual motivation, and my goal is to give you a little bit of history in this area. Then we're going to take a look at some of the science and taking a look at it from a comparative perspective, taking a look at what we know in lower animals, and then taking a look at what we know in the case of humans, and ultimately get into the controversial areas of sexual orientation and what biological factors, social factors may be involved in sexual orientation. So we have a lot on our plate for today, so let's begin. If you take a look at the history of the study of sexual motivation, there's been a lot of taboos that have been associated with a study of sexual behavior. And those taboos are ones that essentially have dictated what kind of research gets done. And certainly there's been a huge delay in our understanding of sexual motivation because of all of these taboos that are associated with its study. I think that we've now gotten beyond that, and there's more and more good, solid scientific research that's being done in this area, but it took a while to get there. There's a lot of patients who need help, and oftentimes I think the science behind the study of sexual dysfunction has lagged behind the needs that are out there by many people who go to a psychologist or go to a psychiatrist or go to a physician, and oftentimes the underlying science behind various treatments is simply not there. So there are gaps in our knowledge, and those gaps in our knowledge are regrettable because, again, there's many individuals who seek help in terms of understanding their sexuality as well as the sexuality of a partner. So that being said, let's look at the history in this area. There are certainly, I think, some important historical moments and try to get up to speed on what some of those historical moments are. One individual certainly that played a role in this history is John Watson, and John Watson, you know, to be involved in the area of learning, but he was also very much interested in the study of sexual motivation, and at the time that he was doing research in this area, there was really very little that was known other than there were changes in heart rate and pulse rate during sexual activity, sexual intercourse. So what Watson did was to analyze really his own sexual behavior. And one of the things that he did was to get his female research assistant involved in this work. And one of the things that he did was he hooked up an EEG machine to himself as well as his female research assistant, and he proceeded to have sexual intercourse with her. And certainly very unethical what he did, but his wife found out why he was spending such long hours in the laboratory, and she sued him for divorce, and he had to resign his professorship at Johns Hopkins University. He went on to get involved in advertising in New York City. Did that for a number of years, but he died really a broken and a tragic figure. He died from alcoholism. So again, John Watson, you know, why do we recognize this as being an important historical moment? Well, it's really because he was one of the first individuals to want to study, though unethical, wanted to study scientifically sexual behavior and sexual motivation. So again, this was an important moment, pivotal moment, because again, research up until this time certainly didn't involve observations like what John Watson was doing. Certainly Sigmund Freud and the study of the libido, that infants obtain this sexual pleasure by way of these erogenous zones. We talked about this a little bit in some previous lectures. The mouth, the anus, the genital area. Freud, of course, believed that sexual preferences in adult life were really very much dependent upon how well these erogenous zones were being stimulated during those important milestones, those stages of psychosexual development. So again, unless that is resolved during that period of time, then Freud would say that sexual preferences might be delayed or even not what we necessarily would expect. So again, two very important historical figures, both Watson and Sigmund Freud. Another important historical figure certainly is Alfred Kinsey and the institute that he established at Indiana. And he did some very interesting survey work that depended upon volunteers about sexual attitudes. And these are some of his major findings that you see here. And there's a few that I've noted. For example, males reported premarital sex 67 to 98% of males reported this, and it varied by economic level to some extent, in that individuals who were wealthier tended to report more premarital sex. Females reporting premarital sex about 50%. And here's another one: males who reported masturbating 92%, females who reported masturbating 62%. This is coming out in the 1950s, and this is very provocative research. The American public was indeed shocked by the reporting for premarital sex as well as masturbation. Keep in mind that these were not randomly selected individuals, that instead consisted of people who volunteered. And that in and of itself could be problematic in terms of the actual results that were obtained. It could be biased. So again, certainly not perfect work by any means from the vantage point of scientific methodology. But nonetheless important, because this is now beginning to open the door a little bit more in terms of our understanding of sexual motivation. And then along comes two probably the most important figures in this area, William Masters and Virginia Johnson. They were the real pioneers in human sex research. And they wrote two classic books. One was called Human Sexual Response, that was published in 1966, and then Human Sexual Inadequacy, both of them books that were very well received and pivotal in terms of helping us to understand human sexual responses. The real interesting part of their work, and very controversial, was that they pay prostitutes to participate in their experiments. So again, they're doing firsthand observations in these individuals who agreed to participate. And they broke a lot of barriers in terms of publishing research on sexual behavior in humans. And for a long time, there's an enormous stigma that was associated with this, and no reputable scientific journal would publish any of their work. Finally, after presenting some of their work at a meeting of the American Psychological Association, these barriers started to come down, and they were also allowed to start applying for, and then ultimately they received research grants from our federal government in order to do their work. So again, this was an enormous advance that was made at this time, and to their credit, they never gave up, and they stuck with it, and ultimately their work was peer-reviewed and appeared in some of the best scientific journals. So it's a real success story and a real important part of this history. When you take a look at some of their findings, certainly in terms of the research that they did, they really defined what we call the sexual response cycle. And you see really the same kind of physiological reactions in males that you see in females. No matter what type of stimulation brings a male or a female to climax, the physiological changes that you see always occur in the same order. So, for example, both males and females go through excitement stage, then plateau, and then ultimately orgasm, and then what we would call resolution. So this is what you see in the case of a male. This is what you see in the case of a female. And indeed, both males and females go through these same fundamental changes that you see here. So in terms of their research findings, this was, incredibly important. Another aspect of their work, equally, if not more important, was that of what we would call what they referred to as the new sex therapy. And, at the time that their new therapy was coming out, or prior to the time that it came out, sexual problems like premature ejaculation in the male, frigidity in the female, they were thought to be caused by repression and by guilt and early kinds of traumatic experiences. In other words, Freudian kinds of interpretations. But what Masters and Johnson said, which was so different, was that sexual problems in terms of sexual functioning were really due to ignorance. They were due to the failure of both males and females to learn adequate sexual responding, to learn, for example, arousal signals on the part of their partner. So this is an entirely different way of approaching sexual dysfunction. And, and indeed, this new kind of therapy involved the use of sexual surrogates, that is, individuals that were part of a research team that would actually engage in sexual activity, sexual behavior with a patient that was having problems. So again, this is an important, very important advance in this particular area. And Masters and Johnson are really considered to be extraordinary pioneers in this area. So what I want to do now, after having looked at a little bit of this history, I want to focus our attention on hormones and focus on what has been done in lower animals, and then focus on the human. And this is a really interesting story, and it's going to allow us ultimately to take a look at those really important questions about sexual orientation, and how much of it is related to genes and biology, hormones, and so on, and how much of it may be related instead to social factors. So this is a very important area of the study of motivation. So let's remind ourselves of this very important theory that was first introduced in the area of the study of aggressive motivation, and it's this organization activation theory of testosterone effects upon behavior, that the brain is organized during early life by the presence of testosterone that is having very pronounced effects on certain brain areas, that in turn, that brain later on during pubertal and adult life, when testosterone starts to surge, that activates these various behaviors that we see. So in the case of the male, it's the presence of this testosterone during early life, which is then activated during pubertal and adult life by testosterone again. That's what it takes to be a male. What it takes to be a female is no testosterone during early life, no testosterone during later life. This is an important theory, and indeed one of the things that we know is that testosterone during early life has these important dual actions. It masculinizes the brain, it promotes male characteristics. That's what's happening during this organizational period. And secondarily, what we know is that it defeminizes the brain, meaning that it suppresses female characteristics. And indeed, testosterone during pubertal and adult life activates behavior. So, having said this now, reminding ourselves of this very important theory, this organization activation theory, let's now move on to what we know in terms of male sexual behavior. And here you see a male rat that is mounting a female. Here's the male right here, here's the female, and the female starting to show this response that we call the Lordosis response. It's the intense arching of her back that allows the male to mount and then intromit and ultimately to ejaculate. So and what we know in terms of sexual behavior in lower animals, and again, we're going to be referring to the rat a great deal in this research. The sexual activity in the male is what we call acyclic. In other words, once a male reaches puberty, the male is more or less ready to engage in sexual behavior at all times. And indeed, all we need is the presence of a sexually active female. What we also know is that testosterone is absolutely essential in the case of lower animals. When a male, for example, is castrated during adult life, they show very little, if any, sexual behavior at all. But if they are then given what is called replacement therapy, where they're given injections of testosterone, they will show a return of their sexual activity. We also know that sexual behavior is coordinated in the hypothalamus. There are very specific receptor sites there in the male for testosterone. And indeed, it's in the area of the hypothalamus, in the area of that sexually dimorphic nucleus that we talked about in some of our previous lectures. So there's elegant research that's been done showing that if you actually implant small amounts of testosterone in the brain of a male that has had his testes taken away, that's been castrated, that will cause that male to exhibit sexual behavior after just putting a tiny amount of testosterone into their brain, into the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is an important coordinating area. Research that's been done in which the brain has been lesioned, where hypothalamus, where the receptors are for testosterone, those males simply show no sexual behavior at all. And indeed, it doesn't matter how much testosterone you give them, you cannot activate their sexual behavior. We also know that the presence of testosterone during early life is essential for male sexual behavior. This is going to allow the male to respond to testosterone later on in life. Remember, it's having all of these very pronounced effects upon the brain in terms of the structure of the brain and how the neurons are connecting with one another. So clearly, testosterone, the presence of it during that organizational period as well as that activational period are crucial, for male sexual behavior. When we begin to take a look at the female, again, take a look at what is happening here in terms of the female exhibiting this lordosis response that you see here, and again that you see here. This is normal female sexual behavior. It's called lordosis, and we can score this and take a look at this. Here's no lordosis. Here's the beginning of it that you see here, moderate lordosis, and this is very strong lordosis. So indeed, been many studies that have been done in which experimenters simply have stimulated the flank area of the female. And if the female is sexually active, she will show this lordosis response. So what do we know? Let's take a look at this important figure that you see here, which shows the various phases of the menstrual cycle in the human female. And note the changes that occur in these two hormones, okay, estradiol in the blue and progesterone here in the red. And you can see here's the time of ovulation right here. The cycle of the human is 28 days. You see this rise that occurs in estrogen, and it's followed, now take a look at the red, this is progesterone, is followed towards the end of ovulation by progesterone. And again, this is the period of time in which an egg is being produced. Now, when we take a look at what happens in the case of lower animals like the rat, they have a compressed cycle. In the case of the human, it's 28 days. In the case of a rat, it's only 5 days. So it's only maybe about a 14 to 24-hour period of time in which the female is sexually active. And the female also, lower animals go through these same kind of changes, this increase that you get in estrogen, which is followed shortly by an increase that occurs in progesterone. So when you take a look then at sexual behavior in females and lower animals, in the female we call it cyclic, meaning that the female is going through periods of time where she's very receptive to a male, and other periods of time where she's not during her cycle. And it seems to be associated with these hormonal changes that are occurring. Estrogen and progesterone appear to be essential for female sexual behavior in lower animals. If you, for example, take away the ovaries in an adult female, the female will show little, if any, interest in engaging in sexual behavior with a male. If you inject her with estrogen and progesterone, a little bit of estrogen followed by a little bit of progesterone, she will become sexually active and will engage in sexual behavior with a male. We also know that a coordinating point for those hormones is in the hypothalamus. And indeed, this work is very important because we know that if we just take even a small amount, excuse me, even if we take a small amount of estrogen and progesterone and place it in the hypothalamus of a female that's had her ovaries taken away, that will cause a return of her sexual activity. The absence of testosterone during early life is also a requirement for female sexual behavior. For example, if a genetic female is given testosterone early in life, she will be unresponsive to estrogen and progesterone later on in life. So indeed, we have this very important hormonal relationships that we see in the case of lower animals, where they very much are dependent upon hormones for sexual behavior. If you take a look at hormones and sexual behavior in humans, you see a very different, but nonetheless a very interesting story. First of all, consider the methodological problems that are involved here in studying this. We know that in the case of the human, there are certainly the complexity of sexual behavior in terms of psychological and social and cultural factors are obviously incredibly important, and it makes doing research in this area very difficult. The lack of scientifically valid experimentation is certainly evident through a lot of the work that has been done in the past. So we're really forced to rely on a lot of clinical reports. Patients that suffer, for example, from clinical or mental disorders. And there's a lack of control procedures. There's this inability really to trust the validity of patient-doctor interviews oftentimes. Certainly we don't have a situation where an experimenter can ask a human if they would relent to, having their testes removed in the case of the male, or ovaries removed in the case of a female, in order to study their sexual behavior. These are things that simply we cannot do. So you have to be very creative in this area in terms of doing research that is going to be meaningful. But that being said, let's take a look at what we do know. In the case of the human female, one of the interesting ways of trying to explore this is to take a look at females that are going through menopause. So their hormones are shutting down, or take a look at females that have had their ovaries removed prior to the time of menopause. We call it premenopausal ovariectomy. If hormones are playing an important role, we would expect in those conditions that you'd see a decline in sexual interest and sexual arousal and sexual behavior. And that simply is not true. So that would suggest that probably in humans, estrogen and progesterone may not be playing a very important role. There's some evidence showing that that hormones, however, do modulate sexual arousal in the human female. If you take a look at women, for example, that maintain diaries and self-report in terms of their level of sexual interest and level of sexual behavior over the course of their cycle. These are women that are cycling normally. Oftentimes they report that their level of sexual arousal is highest during ovulation. That's when estrogen and progesterone are dramatically changing. And indeed, they're much more likely to experience an orgasm during that period of time. So, this is, suggestive that estrogen may be involved in mediating what we would call arousability, okay, in the female. In terms of what we know in the human male, the effects of castration in the human male seem to be variable. Some males show a rapid and complete decline in their level of sexual arousal, while other males show little or no effects. Some of that may be due to prior sexual experience, but again, this is an area where, again, we're depending upon self-reporting, we're depending upon the honesty of individuals in terms of reporting on their sexual activity, and It may be that males oftentimes are unwilling to admit to problems that they're having with their own sexuality. Hypogonadism, an interesting clinical condition in which males are not secreting enough testosterone. And oftentimes it's associated with a decline in sexual interest. Treatment of those individuals with testosterone elevates their sexual interest. So indeed, you have something that's certainly not identical to what we see in lower animals, but perhaps may be related to what we see. A little bit related to what we see. Certainly not the all or nothing kind of situation that we have in lower animals. So again, the data are a little bit supportive of what we see in the case of lower animals, but not completely supportive. How about this whole idea of sexual orientation now as we move, into this area? Is it related to testosterone? There's been a wide number of studies that have been done in this area in which they've taken a look at levels of testosterone and levels of sexual behavior on the part of males, and whether or not it's related to sexual orientation. That is, some have suspected that maybe high levels of testosterone might be related to, high levels of heterosexual behavior. Low levels might be related to homosexual behavior, perhaps. And the studies that have been done, for example, in which they've looked at pubertal testosterone levels and male sexual orientation, they find absolutely no relationship at all. Studies that have been done taking a look at adult testosterone levels and male sexuality, they also show absolutely no relationship at all. When we take a look at testosterone exposure during early life, prenatal life, and sexual orientation, then we begin to see some interesting things. And we need to take a look at that and explore that, because this is a fascinating area, which is now suggesting that this indeed may be very much related to sexual orientation. So let's talk about an older study that was done some years ago that had to do with prenatal stress and the impact that that has on developing male fetuses. Here you can see this is a pregnant rat that's been placed into a small tube, and there's a very intense light that's above this female rat that's pregnant. It's a very stressful situation, putting them in that tube and exposing them to that hot light. And it's done for 3 hours a day during the second and third trimester of pregnancy. So the duration of pregnancy in the female rat is in the neighborhood of 20 to 21 days. So what we're talking about is the last 14 days of pregnancy. And then what they do is they take a look at the male offspring of that female that's been stressed, and they explore the sexual activity, the sexual behavior of that of those males later on in life. And here's what they find. Focus your attention just on this control condition that you see here in the black histogram, and in the prenatal stress condition in the red. Don't pay any attention to this right here. And this just shows the percentage of males that exhibited, male copulatory behavior, and you can see pretty high level in the control condition and a fairly low level in the case of the prenatally stressed males. This is very interesting research when you take a look at what happens in these male rats in terms of whether or not they can be induced to show female-like behavior by giving them estrogen and progesterone. You can see that these prenatally stressed animals are pretty responsive to estrogen and progesterone. Indeed, it is suggesting that their brain simply is not as masculine and maybe more feminine, and suggests that maybe they're not being exposed to enough testosterone during early life. Research indeed shows this, that this is in the red, this is a stressed male, this is during days 17 to 23 of fetal life. In the red, this is prenatally stressed male. In the blue, this is a normal male, and it looks like testosterone is peaking at an earlier period of time, at a time in which the brain perhaps cannot really respond to it. So this is very interesting and suggestive that these prenatally stressed males during fetal life are not being exposed to the amount of testosterone that ordinarily is needed in order to masculinize their brain. So this is a provocative, very provocative finding. If you take a look at some very interesting human research that's been done in this area, this scientist that you see here, German scientist Gunther Dorner, examined male homosexuality in the male offspring of women who were in their last trimester of pregnancy during a very stressful period of time, the World War II bombing of Berlin. And when he takes a look at those male offspring, again, they're being carried by women who are being exposed to this incredibly stressful period of time, and he finds his results show a higher than normal incidence of male homosexuality in those males. So again, the rat experimentation and this experimentation are very interesting because there's some parallels there. And indeed, in the case of the human, if it's anything like what we see in the rat, then perhaps they're not being exposed to enough testosterone during this very early period of development of the brain. When you take a look at some other controversial work in this area, work that was performed by Simon Levay, when he compared heterosexual and homosexual brains, focus your attention on this figure that we see right here, which shows sexual orientation. These are heterosexual females, homosexual males, and heterosexual males. And you can see that this area of the hypothalamus is quite large in normal heterosexual males, but it is quite small in homosexual males. And in heterosexual females, as you would expect, the hypothalamus, that sexually dimorphic nucleus, is very much smaller than what you see in heterosexual males. So it looks like homosexual males have a brain that's more like that of a female, a heterosexual female, than a heterosexual male. Again, suggesting that perhaps they're not getting enough testosterone. This research is very controversial, primarily because the patients that they worked with here, these are all post-mortem examinations that are being done, and there were AIDS patients in this homosexual male condition. So that information is something that's still subject to some level of criticism. When we take a look at sexual orientation in females, female lesbians, there's three primary areas of research here that have become very important. Money and Earhart, in their work on what's called the adrenogenital syndrome, Bailey and Pollard, their concordant studies with identical and fraternal twins, and then ultimately the very famous case of Joan. And we'll take a look at all three of these. Let's first take a look at this very interesting clinical syndrome called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. You'll see this acronym CAH very often. Here's what you normally see in terms of the relationship between the anterior pituitary gland and the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex. The anterior pituitary secretes ACTH. It prompts the adrenal gland to secrete cortisol, and that cortisol comes back to suppress the future release of this ACTH, to at least modify it and reduce it. But in the case of this congenital adrenal hyperplasia that you see here, what is happening is there's an excess amount of ACTH that is being secreted. It's going to enlarge the adrenal cortex, and what's going to happen is, the adrenal cortex ordinarily secretes a very small amount of the male hormone, testosterone. Here it's referred to as androgen, same thing. And what happens is, once that gets into circulation, it can virilize the external genitalia, like what you see here. This is an enlarged clitoris that we see in the case of a female. And there's also suspicion that it gets up into the brain and is acting on the hypothalamus to partially masculinize the hypothalamus. So when you take a look at these individuals, these females with this syndrome, this congenital adrenal hyperplasia, they have twice the national average of lesbianism in these girls. So this is very interesting, which suggesting that, there's something about testosterone exposure during early life that is perhaps influencing the brain to at least partially masculinize or defeminize the brain of the female. Twin research on homosexuality has proven to be some of the most important work that has been done in this area, and this is the research of Bailey and Pollard, this concordance research. If you take a look at this slide that you see right here, take a look at identical twins and fraternal twins. This is in homosexual males. So the concordance rate is 48%. You see right here. That is roughly, half the time when one member of an identical twin pair is, 52%. When one member of an identical twin pair has been described as homosexual, chances are, their co-twin, half the time is also going to be homosexual. Fraternal twins, on the other hand, is only 22%. This is a highly significant statistical difference that you see here. When you take a look at homosexual women, again, do the same comparison, identical twins and fraternal twins. What you see is that, roughly half the time when one member of an identical twin pair, when one member is homosexual, the other one is as well, roughly half the time, in comparison to only 16% in the case of fraternal twins. This research by Bailey and Pollard is very convincing that there are predisposing factors that are involved in terms of genetic predisposing factors, in terms of sexual orientation. And indeed, this is, I think, some of the most important work that has been done in the whole area of sexual orientation. And then we get the very famous case of Joan. Indeed, this is a fascinating story of a woman who had identical twin males. And then at the time of circumcision, something goes wrong with one of them, and his penis is burned off, and the decision is made to raise that child as female. Indeed, here you have these two children. They are both genetic males, but one is being raised as male. This is the one right here, and this one is being raised as female. And indeed, if you take a look at some of the other pictures here, here is this young individual, the one that has been assigned as female, whose name is Joan. And indeed, here's Joan at the age, I believe, is like 13 or 14 years of age. And the conclusion, Joan, a happy and successful girl. This was a case that was being handled by a very distinguished endocrinologist and psychiatrist by the name of John Money. And if you take a look at John Money's clinical notes and what he wrote about this situation, I think is very interesting. He says, these are identical twins. They're coming from the same womb. They're obviously the same sex, but they have a different nurture. One is being raised as male, and the other is being raised as female. So Money reports in his clinical assessment that Joan was a very successful girl. And based upon this very interesting accident of nature, he says that, nurture, it's nurture over nature. That's the most important factor involved in development in terms of gender. It's really about gender assignment, and it's really not about any kind of genetic predisposition. So again, I think that this is very interesting, what John Money has to say, and it really becomes the foundation for how various conditions are treated, such as micropenis and accidental penile amputation. This becomes the standard. But then another researcher comes along by the name of Milton Diamond. Joan becomes very uncomfortable as she gets on into her teen years, and then starts asking questions. And indeed, there are other indications all along that Joan was having difficulty in terms of her gender. And to the point where Joan now requests to parents and to John Money, feels uncomfortable about who they are and or who she is, and she requests a sex reassignment. And indeed, the story of what had happened earlier is finally told to this individual, and this sex reassignment occurs. And Milton Diamond writes about this very extensively and takes a viewpoint that's very different from that of John Money, and concludes that prenatal genetic and hormonal influences are really way, way more important, and that they predispose you at an early period of life to be a male or a female in terms of sexual identity. So he's took a very, very different view from the view that was maintained by John Money. So this sexuality then is pushing you in a particular direction. that there's this built-in bias, and it has to do with genes, and it has to do with the impact of hormones. So sexual behavior and gender roles are not neutral. There's this initial direction that occurs at the time of birth. It's being set in motion by genes as well as hormones. And Diamond believes that it's really much more about nature than it is about nurture. So this is a fascinating study, case study, and it's one that's often talked about, and it's one in which I think that we still have a long ways to go in terms of understanding nature and nurture and their contribution to sexual orientation. But I think that what is emerging now is this recognition that genes and hormones are extremely important. So when we take a look then at studies that have been done since this time, and we take a look at some of the conclusions that have been made in this area in terms of sexual orientation research, the organ that determines psychosocial development without question is the brain. Okay. And we also know that sexual identity is not just a product of genes, but it's a product of testosterone and those testosterone effects on the brain that are happening during very early life. In the case of the human being, these are things that are happening during prenatal life. And sexual orientation, again, there's this recognition now that it is in fact about nature, that a significant part of it is. And if it is, then think about social policies and think about how we go about treating individuals that are gay, individuals that are lesbian. Social policies need to change. If indeed this is something that is biological, then that changes the whole picture in terms of how those individuals should be treated. So indeed, this is another area where the field of behavioral neuroscience is having dramatic effects upon how we go about conceptualizing things like sexual orientation. And as we learn more about both biological and social and cultural factors, I mean, this is going to help us even more in order to truly understand the nature of sexual orientation and what kinds of biological factors. We've enumerated a few, and what kinds of social factors may be involved in this. So this really concludes our area of the study of motivation. And indeed, this whole area of sexual motivation is a fascinating area.